Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for joining us for our online open house for the Central Corridor High Capacity Transit Study. We are in Step 2, Define Subcorridors. And we really appreciate your participation. It's very important to the success of this project. And what we're going to do here today is discuss a few things with you, give you some context for the project, and then get right into some pretty critical questions that we have for you and things that we'd like your feedback on as we kick off this important project for Central Texas. My name is John Michael Cortez. I'm on the Project Connect team from Capital Metro. I'm joined here today by Scott Gross from the City of Austin's Transportation Department and Mr. Kyle Cahey, who's our Urban Rail Program Manager, and all part of the Project Connect team that's working on the Central Corridor High Capacity Transit Study. Again, we thank you for your participation. We've got a lot to get through today, so I'm going to jump right into it. Again, for those of you who are just joining us, hopefully you can see in the chat box, we've sent you a couple of links to some documents, supporting documents. One of them, our map book, which has several maps that illustrate some data that we'll be using to kick off this process. And then as well, a document with a few slides that talks about some proposed goals and objectives for the project. It's probably a good idea if you have the capability to click those and open them up, because we're going to refer to them a few times potentially throughout the conversation today. In addition, we are recording this, so if you miss anything, we will put it up on the web so others can listen to it. And in addition, if you have questions, or we might ask you a question at some point in the presentation, feel free to submit anything at any time through the question box that you have there. We are going to try to answer questions at the very end so that we can get through the significant amount of material that we have to cover today. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. First, again, a little bit of the context for the Central Corridor study. This study has been undertaken by the Project Connect partners. Project Connect is a partnership among Central Texas transportation agencies, including the City of Austin, Capital Metro, the Capital Area Metropolitan Planning Organization, and Lone Star Rail District, who have come together to address some pretty significant challenges that we face as a region. Everybody knows that the Central Texas region is growing like crazy, and with that growth comes lots of tremendous opportunities. It's great for business, it's great for a lot of things, but of course it also creates some challenges that we have to address together as a region. And we can't solve every problem, but we have selected these 5 regional challenges and opportunities that we're trying to address through Project Connect. And the first one is centers. We have come together as a region around this concept of trying to focus as much of our future growth as possible into what are called activity centers throughout the region. These are places of activity where people can accomplish and meet a lot of their daily needs in one place without necessarily having to get on a highway and travel very far. So these are places where you can live, you can work, you can recreate, you can shop, you can go to school, get medical care if you need it. You can meet most of your life's needs in one place. So there are different kinds of activity centers of different sizes. Of course, our largest activity center is the area in and around downtown Austin. But we have smaller activity centers that are growing, like Hutto or Kyle or Lockhart, places of varying sizes. We have those activity centers have been around for a while. We have brand new emerging activity centers. For example, the University Boulevard up there north of Round Rock, which is an incredible place if you've not been there. I mean, there was nothing there 10 years ago, and now there's 5 or 6 colleges, and several hospitals, and lots of retail and residential. The Mueller redevelopment is another activity center that's emerging, and there's several of those throughout the region. So our challenge with centers, even though we're creating these places where you can do a lot in one place, realistically, you're going to have to leave those centers for some reason. And so we want to provide connections among all those centers so that people can travel conveniently and freely among those centers. In addition, though, the second challenge we have is to connect all those multiple activity centers to the core of our region, which is the area in and around downtown Austin. There's so much economic activity and so many cultural institutions and attractions there in the core of our city, core of our region. It's going to be very important that we connect all those existing and emerging activity centers to the core, which is the area around downtown Austin. So that's the second challenge we're trying to address through Project Connect. The third is constraints. Gone are the days where we can just widen out all the highways to make it easy for people to travel in and around the region. In some places, like this aerial, the area that this is depicted here in this aerial, which is I-35 through downtown Austin, we don't have very many opportunities to make these things wider. There are some things we can do to make the existing space we have operate a little bit more efficiently, and we're looking at that. But this is just one example of some constraints that we have, which forces us to look at alternatives such as what we call high-capacity transit. And we'll talk more about that in a second. In addition, I don't need to belabor the fact, most of you are aware that we are an incredibly congested region, where our congestion is getting to the point where it's really starting to threaten some of our economic vitality and quality of life. Some would say that we're way past that point. But congestion is certainly something that we have to address, provide people with some options to having to sit in that congestion so that their quality of life is not diminished. And then, of course, growth is a challenge that we must deal with. As fast as we're growing today, we're projected to potentially start growing even faster in the future. So we have a lot of ground to make up, and we need to move very quickly. So those are the five kind of meta challenges that we're trying to address throughout the region through Project Connect. And you'll see these themes of regional challenges and opportunities come up again later in the presentation, so please keep these in mind. So what we have done through the Project Connect partnership over the last couple of years is working with our partners throughout the region, working with the community, is develop a vision for how we could address those five regional challenges and opportunities with a system that serves the region with high-capacity transit. So you'll hear the term high-capacity transit several times today. High-capacity transit is a little bit different from the kind of transit that we mostly have today here in our region, which would be local bus service. High-capacity transit is differentiated by its ability to carry a lot of people, many more than would fit in a normal bus, faster and more reliably than our local bus service. So this is big stuff. These are big projects like commuter rail, like metro rail, regional rail like the Lone Star Rail project, urban rail, express transit running in express lanes, and bus rapid transit such as Metro Rapid, which Capital Metro is about to introduce in the region next year. So it uses lots of different kinds of transit tools in the toolbox where it's appropriate to connect existing and emerging activity centers to each other and to the core of our region, again addressing several of those regional challenges that we talked about. This is a long-term vision. However, it's a very realistic vision. There are pieces of this that are already in place or that are under construction and about to be in place for people to enjoy. And then what we're talking about today is the next steps towards getting projects ready to fill out more of this system. So today we have in place our first investment in high-capacity transit in the region, Metro Rail, which is this thick red line here, which operates from Leander to downtown Austin with 9 stations. It's operating very successfully. Since the start of service, ridership has more than tripled. We have full loads of people every morning coming out of Leander and Lakeline Station and Howard. By the time it hits this Howard Station in the morning, that thing is completely full. And then later on today, this afternoon, you'll see full trains departing downtown to drop people off at the stations on the way back up north. So that's our first investment's working very well. You may have heard we're very fortunate. We just won a Tiger grant of $11+ million to expand capacity on that service because it's been so successful. So that's one piece we already have in place. Another piece that we're working on that's under construction now are these 2 green lines running on 4 of the busiest corridors in our region, North Lamar, South Congress, and Burnett and South Lamar. And that will be a new type of high-capacity transit called Metro Rapid, a bus rapid transit service, a premium service that's going to stop at 76 stations along these busy corridors, really connecting a lot of the most important destinations in our region together with very frequent, more reliable, high-capacity transit. So again, these 2 pieces are under construction, and you'll be able to use those at this time next year. So that's That's in place. In addition, the Mobility Authority is working on and under construction some express lanes here along Mopac, in which we plan to run express transit when they're done sometime around 2015. So those will be great. While people are stuck in traffic on Mopac, you'll be able to zoom by them in a transit vehicle at 45, 50 miles an hour from the north part of our region to downtown Austin. So that's exciting. So you can start to see we have pieces of this vision that are already coming into focus and becoming real, which we're very excited about. But we need to continue to move forward and start to advance more projects, because eventually we want to get this whole thing built out. If you remember nothing else today, please remember that what the project really is, what the goal really is eventually to develop this entire system. And what we're talking about today is what should be the next step. We tend to focus on projects in isolation, and that's important because we need to get the right project. But remember, our end goal is to build out this entire system. This is what will address those regional challenges, not one rail line or one bus line. So keep that in mind. So again, we have our regional plan, our system plan, which is Project Connect, our vision for serving the entire region. The next step to make some of these projects come to reality are the corridor studies. And that's where we are right now with two parts of the vision, the North Corridor and the Central Corridor. We're nearly done identifying the projects that we'd like to bring to the community in the North Corridor. And those projects should be identified by the beginning of next year. What we're here to talk about today is the Central Corridor. What should be the next project, high-capacity transit investment in the Central Corridor? Once we're done with these corridor studies, then we have an actual project to advance. And we can move it to the next phase of the process, which is where you get into preliminary engineering, your environmental assessment. You wrap all those up, you do final design, and then hopefully we get the money to construct it, like we're currently at that stage with Metro Rapid. And then, of course, when you're done, you get to operate it, such as Metro Rail. So as you can see, we're trying to break off chunks of that vision and advance them down this process so that they're available for you to use and meet the needs that you have on a daily basis. That's the process we're going through. So as you can see, again, existing, we have Metro Bus and Metro Rail, and those will continue to receive investment and continue to grow and be important. Coming soon, we have Rapid in 2014, Express Transit and Express Lanes in 2015. And these three projects you see here in next steps, those are the next things we want to advance. And particularly here today, we're talking about the Central Corridor. And now I'm going to turn it over to Kyle, who's going to get you into the heart of the matter, which is the Central Corridor. Okay, Kyle.
Thank you, John Michael. Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to turn the corner. Appreciate all the good context that John Michael provided. The Project Connect effort is a significant accomplishment regionally in the sense that it did pull together a lot of diverse ideas and consolidated them into a singular vision. And this is actually the foundation for all of the subsequent corridor studies that are going to be moving forward. As John Michael indicated, during the Project Connect effort, there were a number of travel corridors that were identified. We've highlighted them on this particular slide. There were 8 radial corridors, all centered on the Central Corridor. And so the Central Corridor is the critical link in every corridor study that we will move forward with. And during the Project Connect study, they also identified the North and the Central Corridor as priority corridors to proceed with investment. So as John Michael indicated, the North Corridor effort is underway, a lot of progress being made there, and we are now ramping up the Central Corridor effort. Excuse me, just a little technical glitch there. As John Michael indicated too, you do have the Campo plan, you have the system plan, which is represented by Project Connect, and we are now in the corridor studies. What I like to highlight is what we are not, and just to restate what John Michael said, we are not in the project development phase, which would require the environmental focus on a specific project as well as preliminary engineering or final design. So the corridor studies are really peeling off that next project, being able to look at specific alignments, evaluate those alignments, and be able to make a determination of a phrase that you'll hear us use, a locally preferred alternative. And so as we go forward with this effort, you're going to hear us talk about how do we arrive at that locally preferred alternative. Transit planning has been around in Austin for many years, and in recent time we've had several proposals that have come forward that have been pitched as answers, if you will, and we've received a lot of comment and criticism that we haven't brought the public along in order to understand and reach agreement or consensus about what that next investment is. So we were asked as a project team to identify a work plan that will allow us to do the technical work, but share that technical work with the public, receive input, receive course correction, guidance and direction, and ultimately be able to move forward. So we've highlighted this work plan in this stage. There's some green months and some blue months here. The blue months represent the technical team's effort, and the green months indicate those months that we will be bringing information out to the public. As you can see from the arrow, the red arrow, we're very early in this process. We are in the process of identifying and defining some of the sub-corridors that Scott's going to spend a little bit of time talking about. But we have two major tasks that we will be doing between now and next June. By the end of this year, we intend to be able to identify and define a series of sub-corridors within the central corridor, evaluate those at a fairly high level, and be able to offer a recommendation regarding the next direction or the next sub-corridor that would be the priority corridor for making the next high-capacity transit investment. After we've made that decision by the end of this year, then we will move forward in evaluating specific alignments and specific modes. So whether or not it would be a bus rapid transit or an urban rail type of an investment, we'll be making that decision next year. Ultimately, we would have that decision by the June timeframe of 2014, ultimately leading to a possible voter referendum in November of 14 that would support the local funding support for this effort. We do intend to pursue federal funds for this. The Federal Transit Administration has a New Starts program that we believe we would be very competitive in receiving. So half of the project is envisioned as being supported by a local match, as we call it, with the remaining funds supported by federal dollars. One of the key things that we've started to do as we move our analysis forward is defining the study area, and it's an important first step in a multi-step process, as you see here. We've defined initially the study area. We started with the central corridor definition. We've identified a series of problems which we'll talk with you about. Goals and objectives flow from there, as do evaluation criteria, and eventually, subsequent to the evaluation efforts, we would select a priority sub-corridor. So this is a very quick waterfall look at how we are going through our process at this point in time. But let me share with you the study area definition that we've arrived at for the central corridor. Again, we started with the definition that was very broadly and generally identified in Project Connect, and we've put a little bit more definition on this. The idea of this is to focus our analysis within this corridor that will allow us to make a decision about which sub-corridor we will move forward with. The definition here is largely RM 2222 on the north. On the east is Springdale and Grove. On the south is Old Torf, and then, of course, west is Mopac. And so what you're going to see in the next couple of slides is you're going to see identification of some other travel sheds or corridors, sub-corridors that we will be doing our analysis on within this area. One of the key things that we've also looked at is in identifying that study area, we've got a number of problem statements that have emerged. These are the regional challenges that John Michael identified earlier, what we've come to call the 4 C's and a G: congestion, centers, constraints, core, and growth. But we've looked at this within the context of the central corridor as well, and we've added an S. That's the word system. And as you saw from previous slides, the 8 regional corridors converge onto the central corridor, and so all All of these efforts are critical to how we weave those investments together in the central corridor. And so system and the implementation of an overall system is important as we move forward. Based on these regional challenges, we've identified some specific language, and obviously we would want to see your input and reaction to this language, but we've identified problem statements that help us to formulate goals and objectives and evaluation criteria as we move forward in this process. So for example, under the regional challenge of congestion, we have a statement of excessive roadway congestion surrounding the core and the lack of transportation alternatives make travel time to the central corridor unreliable. I can certainly take this week as an example of how that has changed widely on a daily basis. So that is a problem, and one of the opportunities that high-capacity transit can do is introducing a more reliable trip time. Similarly, on the system standpoint, we have a statement that says that existing and planned regional transit investments converge on the central corridor without adequate system integration. Now, quite honestly, a lot of that is absent right now, but we recognize that we have an inherent goal in providing that future system integration as all of these different investments converge onto the central area. Under the regional challenge of centers, we have a statement that the central corridor lacks multimodal connectivity between activity centers. This is really a connect the dots kind of an approach, that as we have identified those land use activity centers in the area, we need to be able to connect those areas. And so that is the challenge that we've identified here. Under constraints and growth, we've identified a problem statement that the central corridor mobility is constrained by existing physical infrastructure and anticipated employment and population growth. Now, those could be pulled apart and you could have separate problem statements, but we also believe those are integrally related, and so we have identified that as a singular problem statement. And then with the regional challenge of maintaining the core, we have simply stated that the vibrancy of the region's core is in jeopardy. The idea is that all of the growth that we're experiencing now has a cost, and a lot of that cost is in the form of congestion, it's in the form of the lack of mobility, and the lack of connections that are there. So those are the problem statements that we've identified at this point in time. What we're going to shift to very quickly with Scott is moving forward. Again, you'll see here the problem statement is kind of the source of a lot of our structure, moving into goals and objectives and evaluation criteria, and ultimately the selection of that priority subcorridor. Scott?
As we're transitioning here, I want to remind you that if you have a question or a comment on anything you hear, go ahead and type it into the question box, and we can get to it at the end of our the presentation, and we'll get to as many as we can in the order that we receive them. So Scott, go ahead and take over.
All right, thank you, guys.
Forgive us for just 1 second. We'll get this fixed. Here we go.
All right, sorry about that. So hopefully this is coming across okay. My name is Scott Gross. I'm the Urban Rail Program Manager for the Transportation Department at the City of Austin, and part of our integrated interagency project team. Also want to point out that we do have some a supplement that goes over the problem statements, goals, and objectives in greater detail that early on John Michael had provided a link, so that's available to you if you missed some of that early on, and still a great reference as we move forward on the rest of the presentation. So what we're looking at now is a framework for the way the problem, as is the waterfall effect kind of showed, from the problem statement flow the goals and then objectives, from which we develop evaluation criteria. What's real important to remember is that the problems by identifying and prioritizing the problems. That helps us focus the evaluation and prioritize what criteria, for instance, are most important to selecting a priority subcorridor. And with that in mind, I'm just going to flip ahead real quick so that you have a feeling for what we are actually evaluating with this criteria. So on your screen, and we'll get to this in more detail later, on the right, that map shows the initial identification of subcorridors around the central corridor. So what's important to bear in mind is with this criteria, we're looking to prioritize and distinguish between these subcorridors. So we're talking about criteria to prioritize an area. This is not criteria that helps us define a project. So this is not the same kind of criteria that we'll be using in phase 2 of the study, for instance, to distinguish between different alignments, for instance, different streets, or different modes or technologies. So whether steel wheels or rubber tires, for instance. So it's a real important contextual element to keep in mind. So going back to the framework here, as I noted, again, problem statement, goals and objectives flow from that, from which flow the evaluation criteria. So again, there's a reminder of that on the right. So this is a set of proposed or draft evaluation criteria, again, that's going to help us select a priority subcorridor. We'll be looking for feedback, in particular on these criteria. We'd like to know what your top 3 criteria are, and certainly if you want to rank more of them than that, that would be that much more instructive to us. But as you recall, this is an online version of the public meetings that we are in the midst of conducting, and so as folks are moving through the public meeting stations with their questionnaire, they're asked to rank their top 3 criteria. So what that does is help us focus our evaluation. We need to know from the community and from our advisory group what really is most important with this next project for the Central Corridor. So the criteria itself, what we have here are not, strictly speaking, the measures that we'll be using. They're a little more generic than that. One example might be population density or employment density. Also, you do have a link to our map book, so a lot of these criteria refer to data that has already been compiled for the Central Corridor, and we've also displayed it kind of with the subcorridor array on top of it, so you can see how the data starts to shake out in the different subcorridors. But population density, employment density, in reality, what we would look at, for instance, our 2010, which is as close to current as we have for population densities, and we would look at future densities. So some of that gets to the details of whether or not we're looking to develop a project that serves existing densities, for instance, versus shapes, where we want future densities and future growth to occur. So these are still kind of broad categories. These aren't the exact measures. Nevertheless, we are looking for that kind of information from you. For instance, if you think population density is an important criterion to consider, then let us know that whether you think, for instance, current population density is more important than future population density, or conversely, we also have mapped growth in population density between 2010 and 2035. So all 3 of those kind of factors are going to be a part of our consideration, but we want to know what's most important to you. One other thing I'll point out is that a lot of these are easily traceable back up to the problem statements. One example is economic development, for instance. Our problem statement for the core, which is the vibrancy of the region's core, is in jeopardy. From that, we have a goal that says enhance focused economic development. And then we have a number of objectives related to economic development. So at the criteria level, economic development flows up, if you will, through those objectives that are related to the goal of enhancing focused economic development, which is a way to respond to one of the premier problems that we've identified for the Central Corridor, and that is the vibrancy of our core is in jeopardy, of the region's core is in jeopardy. One other thing that I'll point out, that the problem statements, we are looking for feedback on those, as well as the goals and objectives. During the public meetings themselves, Station 2 that Kyle covered goes over the problem statements. However, the goals and objectives were provided to the meeting participants as a supplement. It was really too much for us to cover in the span of one meeting, but it is still an important part of the puzzle, and we're still looking for feedback on that. So conversely, the problem statements are something that we are looking for a ranking of. What problems do you think are most important? And certainly, if you have suggestions on kind of wordsmithing, if you will, or revising of the problem statements, we want to hear that.
And Scott, if I can interrupt you for one
Sure.
second. All of you who are participating in this webinar, within the next day or two, are going to receive a follow-up email with a link to an online survey where you'll have the opportunity to rank some of those problem statements, etc. So we're getting that together, and we should be able to follow up with that in just the next couple of days.
Thanks, John Michael. So another thing, I guess, that I'll point out with the criteria, some of them address multiple problems, and I think you'll see that when we get into the evaluation phase. For instance, issues related to social equity do address maintaining the vibrancy or preserving the vibrancy of the core of the region. They also speak specifically to federal criteria. The Federal Transit Administration, from which the New Starts program is a source of funding, and as Kyle mentioned, is where one of the sources that we'll be turning to with this project, the project that emerges out of the Central Corridor High Capacity Transit Study. Some of the criteria that they consider are related to affordable housing and zero vehicle households and other affordability related issues. But typically, the feds measure that in terms of affordable housing and zero vehicle households, for instance. So that's another one of the reasons why those are included as criteria. And that's about it, I think, for the proposed evaluation criteria. Again, we'll be looking for you to rank your top 3, and certainly if there are criteria that are missing or certain methodologies that you think that we should be using in order to measure, for instance, consistency with regional plans, we want to hear that. So as we move on to Station 4, the subcorridor identification process, on the left we have a little montage of maps that really are just intended to convey some of the process that we use to identify and do our initial delineation of the subcorridors. If you recall from the earlier slides where we went over the project work plan, we have a task specifically for identifying subcorridors, but then we have a subsequent task where we define these subcorridors. So right now we are in the process of transitioning from identification to definition of the subcorridors. So this is the initial identification of those subcorridors, and as we as we present this to the community and to our advisory group, as we dig into the data more and look at the characteristics of the individual subcorridors during this definition process, we will likely refine the way these subcorridors look. It may be minor refinements. It may be changing what's in the core, what's out of the core. It may be changing the limits of some of these subcorridors. So all of that is really still subject to change. Our intent with this process is to walk everybody through it step by step. We're not looking to skip anything, and we want you to understand why we're making decisions the way we are and what information we're using to make those decisions. And again, the map book that you have a link to is the source data that we're using to do these identifications and subsequent definitions. So in particular, for instance, the one of the 4 maps on the left that you can see more clearly, the land use map, You can tell that that really helped influence the shape of the East Riverside, or ERC, the East Riverside Corridor subcorridor. East Riverside Corridor is a kind of a city planning area name, so apologies for the ERC subcorridor. But anyway, that gives you an idea of why the boundaries for that corridor are the way they are. One thing to bear in mind is that as subcorridors go, these aren't maybe what folks might think of intuitively as a corridor, which tends to conjure linear notions. But rather, another way to think of these is travel sheds. If you're familiar with the concept of a watershed, which is basically a catchment area or a market, if you will, for water, or in this case, for transit. So generally, these subcorridors are defined as a geographic area that has common travel patterns and somewhat common or complementary characteristics. So it's not necessarily the same thing as a corridor where you would build a project, but it's kind of an area or a travel shed where we would look to develop a project. And really, we're in the process now, ultimately in this phase 1, of prioritizing these subcorridors. So selecting the one that we take the next step with, but recognizing that the other subcorridors are still intended to be developed, to have projects developed within them. But being realistic, we have to focus our resources, and as we look to develop a project, we need to start somewhere. So this exercise is really to decide where to focus our resources for the next phase of the project. I think that's about, so again, we had presented to our advisory group a week ago today, and we spent a little bit more time kind of stepping through the process of identifying and delineating these subcorridors. So again, no one of these maps led to, no one of the data source maps, like the maps on the left, led to the array of these subcorridors. It was looking at all of the information and taking pieces from each to kind of put together the array of subcorridors. So for instance, not included on this slide, but in the map book, are a couple of plots of regional and central corridor travel patterns. So that helped reinforce a radial nature of a radial array of subcorridors, that it reinforced, in our mind, the data supported that the subcorridors within the central corridor would all kind of emanate from the core, downtown and the Capitol complex, and potentially UT as well. That travel patterns typically in this region, their focus, their destinations are often in that core. It's not that there are trips, for instance, that pass through the core, but the predominance of trips terminate in the core. So that led us to a radial array of subcorridors. Other data sets led us to different conclusions. For instance, zero vehicle households or low-income areas help delineate the limits of the MLK subcorridor. We have various activity centers that helped identify, for instance, the Highland subcorridor, the ACC Highland campus and its planned development helped shape that one. So that hopefully gives you an idea of how we got to this process. But now that we've identified them, we're in the process now of defining them further. So it's kind of a two-step process where we take a cut at them, we present them to everybody. We're now continuing to analyze them and looking to get feedback, and then we'll make some refinements before we do any evaluation. Again, we now have 10 subcorridors. We started with the urban rail layer of the Project Connect system plan, which was really 6 lines emanating from downtown. In looking at that and recognizing that there were other areas of the central corridor that at least during the Project Connect system planning effort were not designated as high-capacity transit corridors. Nevertheless, and as Kyle referenced before, what we've heard in the past is that we really need to show our work and give folks the context to come to come to conclusions. So we felt that it would be beneficial to the community to really do a broad, comprehensive comparison of all of the different corridors or subcorridors within the Central Corridor, all of the different travel sheds. So that's one of the reasons why we've ended up with 10. Some of the subcorridors overlap. I mean, there's certainly areas of town where you have choices of how to travel, and recognizing that, you know, some data will be double counted, and that's just a factor of our travel patterns and our geography locally. In other cases, we sense that there are more definitive boundaries between subcorridors, so that's basically what we've seen in the data. The downtown area, the kind of core of the Central Corridor, is part of all of the subcorridors. However, it's not something that would necessarily distinguish any one of the subcorridors from each other. The data for the core of the Central Corridor will be included in our evaluation, but recognizing it's important to recognize that it's really a fundamental part of all of the subcorridors. It's very important for a Central Corridor project to connect the 3 main activity centers within Central Austin, the Central Business District, the Capitol Complex, and UT Austin. So even though UT is not shown as part of the core, it's still very much a priority for this project, and we've gotten a lot of feedback, and we've been asking people at the public meetings to draw on the maps themselves to help us refine these boundaries. So we have gotten feedback that the University of Texas should be considered as part of the core. It should be part of each and every one of the subcorridors. So we're still looking at that and considering that and kind of looking at how that helps or hurts our evaluation. Because again, the intent is to be able to differentiate amongst these subcorridors, and we think that that the UT Austin campus is a differentiator. It also has some very unique travel patterns that are different from what we see in the Capitol Complex and downtown. Both the Capitol Complex and downtown tend to be more of a peak period commute orientation, with trips often coming from much farther out than the Central Corridor. On the other hand, UT has a different mix of travel. Trips come throughout the day and frequently come from closer. So it has different needs, and that was really critical to our initial delineation of these subcorridors, to have UT as part of these northern, if you will, subcorridors. But that's not to say that it will stay that way. I mean, we put it out there to get comment on it, and now we are in the process of kind of synthesizing those comments and soliciting more feedback, and we'll be coming back out with you with a kind of a final definition of these subcorridors in the coming weeks. So moving on, I think we're on to Station 5. So John Michaels, I'm going to turn it over to him, and he'll wrap us up.
And then we'll get to your questions.
Thank you much.
Thank you, Scott. Just very quickly, Kyle already walked you through some of the tasks that we're trying to accomplish here with the Central Corridor study, and you can see we've thrown a lot at you today, but we really are turning the corner, as Kyle mentioned. We're really at the beginning of this process, and we're getting your feedback on a lot of different things up front, but we need it. We need it to define things like the problems that we're actually trying to address here in the Central Corridor, so we can develop the goals and objectives and the evaluation criteria, because all of that is critical to us moving forward, and then also helping us define the subcorridors within the Central Corridor so that we can start to do some comparative analysis among them. So again, we've thrown a lot at you today. There's an awful lot of detail that we couldn't get to in the time frame that we have, but we're certainly going to work along with you as much as we can to make sure that you have the opportunity to understand these issues and to give us the rich feedback that we need to make sure that we're moving in the right direction, literally and figuratively. So as you can see, we're here at the tail end of step 2. Very soon we will be wrapping that up, and then we'll move into step 3, which is selecting the priority subcorridor. So we're going to take all of this feedback that we've received at our public meetings, on this webinar. We'll be out in the community doing stakeholder briefings and workshops when possible, and we'll bring all of that feedback and get through tasks 2 through 6 there, and use that information to begin task 7 and 8, which is to evaluate the subcorridors and select the priority subcorridor. But we're not going to do that in a vacuum or behind closed doors. We're going to bring all that information out to you in November. Again, one of our goals, if you happen to catch our Step 1 webinar, which is on projectconnect.com, which goes into this process in greater detail, I encourage you to watch that if you haven't. You'll recall that one of our primary goals of this project is to be transparent and inclusive. So we're going to make these decisions with the community, along with the community, because at the end of the day, this is something that the community will have to support for it to move forward. So we're likely going to be back with you in November, December with another round of public workshops and meetings and briefings, and definitely at least one more webinar to bring you in to help us make this critical decision come November, December timeframe of selecting which direction do we head in next. And then in January, we'll come back to you, the January, February timeframe, come back out to you again so we can start the process of selecting how do we get there within that subcorridor. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, essentially, and start to answer some of the questions that have been submitted throughout the webinar. And again, if something comes up, you have a question or a comment, please feel free to submit that, and we'll get to as many as we can, time allowing. So with that, I'm going to go to the front. So the first question we had came, how many people are signed in for this event? I think at its peak, we had north of 50. We currently, as some people apparently had to drop off, we're sitting at about 47 attendees right now. But I think we had somewhere north of 70 registrants and had 50-something at the peak. And we're now at, I can see here we had 57 at the peak, and now we're down to 49. Didn't see the map book. Okay, well, if you logged on a bit late, you may not have gotten that one. I'm going to go ahead and send out that message to everybody again so that you have the map book. And just for good measure, I'm going to go ahead and send out the goals and objectives again so that everybody who's on now should get those links. So there you go. This is these are on the City of Austin's CCAG website and connectcentraltexas.com or projectconnect.com respectively. We got, what is the timeline for expansion of the Austin Metro Rail? Well, you may have heard, this was asked by Chris and Lisa, that we recently won Capital Metro, and the region really was very fortunate to be awarded a very competitive Tiger grant for north of $11 million to address some of the capacity issues that we're facing on Metro Rail to be able to improve service, increase service, and address the demand there. I'll have to get back to you on that, Chris and Lisa. I don't have a definitive timeline. I think, you know, we've got a good problem. We now have the money. I don't think we were expecting to have the money to do it. We were developing some conceptual plans. Now we got the money. Now we have to do it. So I'll get back to you on that, Chris and Lisa. We'll have your email address from your registration and try to get a more definitive answer if one exists. Let's see. Why aren't the northeast and south areas high priority areas? That was asked by Maya. So let me go back to that slide. That was the Project Connect prioritization of the different major travel corridors in the region. And it really goes back to this first slide, which was centers, core, constraints, growth, and congestion. So what Project Connect did was look at all of these major travel corridors in the region and evaluate them based on criteria in those 5 areas. So just to give you an example, one of the main goals of the regional challenges we're trying to address is connecting activity centers. And you can just see, you know, just right off the bat from this map, why the North Corridor was very highly ranked in that area. It's got the most activity centers in it, the most opportunities to connect activity centers. So that's just one example. We looked at congestion, we looked at employment and population growth, and this is to say, you know, it's relatively not rated as high. They're all pretty terrible at rush hour. They all need some sort of alternative and some sort of investment eventually. But of course, we don't have the resources to do everything at once. And so we had to be, we think, responsible and judicious with our resources and evaluate them objectively to say, where do we start? And again, our goal eventually is to develop this entire vision that is Project Connect. And you will see that we're going to try to serve as many corridors as we can when it's all said and done, but we have to start somewhere. And so we did that prioritization, and that the North and Central Corridor came out on top. But we'll get to everywhere else eventually. But good question, Maya. What is the plan for continuing the MOPAC corridor to the southern part of MOPAC? That was asked by June. I do believe the Mobility Authority, who's got those North MOPAC lanes under construction, has already started a project to do, I think, a feasibility study of what they can do in the south. They do intend to do it if it's feasible. I don't have a timeline for you, June, but it is moving forward. And we can try to get that from the Mobility Authority and get back to you via email later. Maya asks, why Old Torf versus Ben White? And I imagine, Maya, you're asking about the southern boundary of the Central Corridor. So let me get to that slide here. And Scott, do you want to maybe talk through that?
Sure. I guess for starters, it's real important to recognize that the study area boundary is really something that focuses our efforts rather than limits them. So these are not rigid boundaries, and what that did, and really where we are in this phase of the study, we've kind of moved beyond the boundary of the Central Corridor, and now we're really looking at the various sub-corridors. But what this did, the limits of the Central Corridor study area helped us identify, collect data, and identify what problems are facing the Central Corridor. So whether it's Old Torf or Ben White, or whether it's Ben White or Slaughter, some of that is really, there's a very fluid boundary there, and some of that is really, now that we start defining the sub-corridors in greater detail, that can change. If you notice, the sub-corridors to the south all extend beyond the Central Corridor boundary, in fact. But a lot of this was really driven by common kind of development areas and accessibility to the core of Austin. We started with a boundary that was defined in the Project Connect system planning effort. So as you go farther south, some of those became part of the south and southeast and southwest corridors.
Right. So our next question is from Skip. Why don't you embrace to consider a viably locally invented transit alternative, cellular mass transit, utilizing the existing bus system better in a customer demand-driven approach rather than a scheduled route system combining? It's a pretty long comment. But Skip's referring to a local idea that an engineer has developed for a different approach to transit. That is actually something that some of our transit planners have taken a look at, and there's some concepts in there that are very attractive. But I think the evaluation just at the high level was that that kind of system just really wouldn't address sustainably the challenges that we really face in the region. Certainly there's some things that are interesting and intriguing about it. There's some, I think there's some questions about the cost estimates that were developed for what it would take to actually build and operate such a system. I do, encourage folks to go to the website. You can Google cellular mass transit and take a look at it yourself. But there are some questions we have about that, and again, our initial thoughts on that is that it's not really the kind of thing that's going to address the regional challenges that we have. But certainly we're open to new ideas. Jace asks, which subcorridor will connect the most people to the most jobs and other destinations in less than a 15-minute transit ride? Well, that's a good question. I think that's going to come when we evaluate the subcorridors. Right now, we're trying to define the subcorridors, but Scott wants to jump in some.
Well, that's and actually, there's two questions embedded there. The first one being which subcorridor will connect the most people to the most jobs. So that's some of the criteria that we'll be looking at, are population densities and employment densities. During this definition phase is where we will present a lot of that information, not so much as criteria, but as context to help characterize and better define these subcorridors. And then based on the feedback that we get on the criteria, we may or may not, although I would envision that we plan to use population and employment densities as criteria, but in the next task, then we'll be evaluating based on that criteria. But the next step is really just to put them all of these subcorridors into context.
Will we differentiate between people today and people who are likely to be there 20 years from now, and jobs today and jobs that will likely be there 20 years from now? Are those separate, or do we look at both of those things?
We'll look at both of them. We have data in the map book on both current 2010 population densities and employment densities, as well as future 2035 is what we're showing in the map book now, 2035 population and employment densities, as well as maps that show where the growth is happening. So we will definitely be considering that, but that's a function of the criteria. That gets into more detail about the actual measures that we'll be using. Now, the second part of Jace's question relating to a 15-minute transit ride, that starts to get into phase 2 of the study, because at this point we're really looking at which area, which travel shed, if you will, that we want to focus the project development side of our efforts. So right now, I don't know that we would be able to identify what's within a 15-minute ride, because that really requires us to define a route. So that's something that we'll be looking at in phase 2 of the study. But it's still a very important criterion. And Jace, we can count on you, I trust, to participate in phase 2 as well and reinforce that as an important criterion.
Thank you. John asks, he has a follow-up to the system problem statement regarding inadequate system integration. He says that the proposed north-south high capacity is fantastic, but as the saying, the chain is only as strong as the weakest link. He asks us to please speak to plans to improve the quality and the public's perception of the east-west routes that represent either the first or last mile of door-to-door trip. Ergo, current routes number 4 and 21, they're poorly paced, spaced to feed the new north-south high capacity transit, I guess, system vision. And that's a good question. Working for Capital Metro, I get that a lot. Why don't you have more east-west routes? Well, because we're bus-based, we need more east-west roads to do that, which they're in short supply here in Austin. They're all running to dead ends or they're highways where transit doesn't operate very effectively. But it's a huge challenge here, getting east-west. One of the biggest challenges, of course, is that so much of our travel patterns, though, are north-south. That's why you see so much of a focus on north-south transit, because that's where a lot of people how a lot of people are traveling. But certainly east-west is an issue. I can tell you just offhand that I know Route 4 is going to get some investment here in the near future to improve its service as we continue to beef up all of our regular routes. But I think that's a good question just long term. As we're creating these high-capacity transit lines, we're going to need to upgrade, and that's something. We're focused on high-capacity transit, but the local bus service ain't going away. In fact, it's going to continue to receive lots of investment because we need something that feeds this system. And some of these neighborhoods don't necessarily have high-capacity transit running through them. We're going to need a way for those folks in those neighborhoods to access the high-capacity transit. And more than likely, that's going to be a frequent local bus service that will be traveling east-west, north-south, to try to connect them to the larger projects that will get them across the region where they need to go. So, John, I don't have a specific answer for you, except that is absolutely something that we need to tackle, is the first and last mile for all of these high-capacity transit services. Jace goes on to ask, with regards to the map book, which is more important to look at, projected percent or change of projected 2035 total numbers? That's a good nuanced point there. What would you guys say about that? Maybe both?
Both.
Yeah.
I'm a believer that percentages can be very misleading without an understanding of the underlying absolute numbers.
Yeah.
So I do think that we don't want to focus on percentages without also focusing on what the absolute relative changes might be. So we're going to focus on both. Good question.
Good. So Mateo asks, rail should go where future growth has best potential. So that's more of a statement. I gather that's maybe a goal or an objective that you're suggesting, Mateo, and I appreciate that feedback. Julie asks, how many members of the public are attending this webinar that have not attended an in-person Project Connect Central Corridor open house? Well, I do see a lot of familiar names on here, so I would suspect there's quite a few, including you, Julie, that have participated in several of them, and we encourage that. We encourage folks to participate as much as they want. But I do see some new names on here, so I do think we have some folks that really do prefer this format. And from having done several dozen of these webinars, we do get a different crowd participating in these than we do regular public meetings. So a good question, though. It's something that we're always mindful of. Andre asks, what do you mean by vibrancy in the central core? That's a good question.
Well, vibrant, that is a word that we've received a lot of question about. But I look at downtown Austin at all times of the day, and I see a lot of activity. Maybe it's activity is perhaps a better word. Other downtowns, even in the major cities here in Texas, if you go there in the middle of the day, 10 o'clock, 3 o'clock, you don't see much vibrancy. You don't see much activity. But one of the things that I would also add, this also goes to the issue of economic growth and economic development, economic vitality, which is huge. I can't remember the number I heard yesterday about the number of cranes that we have on the horizon today. I mean, it's pushing 20. And that is another aspect of the vibrancy aspect. Austin has experienced some very steep highs and lows in its real estate and economic growth over the last few decades. Trying to sustain what we have right now is a real challenge. So along with this growth comes a lot of issues we have to deal with. We don't want to choke on that growth. We want to make sure that we can continue to maintain mobility. So that's kind of how we have used the word vibrancy, and as Scott indicated in his comments, we welcome any other suggestions you have about how we could perhaps state that in a more appropriate way, perhaps.
Great. Let's see. Mateo has, it looks like a second suggestion for, looks like a goal or an objective, or maybe even, well, I think this would be a goal or objective. Neighborhoods where rail goes should demonstrate a willingness to increase density in the area that is 5-minute walk or bike from every station. So that, I think, it goes to complementary land use planning, and that is actually something we're looking at in the map book, I think, is in there, and then probably it's going to be something that we move forward in doing an evaluation of the subcorridors. Where do we have that kind of complementary land use planned?
Right. Now I'll add to that. So some of the criteria that we put out there were, one of our priorities is centers. So that's a regional priority. And specifically with the Central Corridor, we have both Imagine Austin Center, or we have Campo centers, so regional centers, as well as Imagine Austin centers. So Imagine Austin centers basically designate those parts of town that that are designated or are willing to varying degrees to become more mixed use and walkable, to become more dense, and that is all transit supportive. So if that's what you think is important, then you should hopefully prioritize centers as an important criterion. So that speaks directly to that.
Let's see. Skip asks, why not add a simple criteria metric where people are and where they want to go for daily travel, such as work, play, entertainment, shopping, eating, church, school? Well, I do think that it's something that we're, looking at where people travel, and it's certainly something that we're taking a look at. And you elaborate on that one, Scott? Or?
I wish it were that simple. There isn't, for instance, a single index that would tell us that, and that's part of, if it were this easy, it would be done by now. But I mean, Skip, you're pointing to really important factors, and certainly that's the kind of feedback we're looking for. We have data in the map book about where people are and where they want to go, and those travel patterns. And we have origin-destination pairs for the Central Corridor and for the 5-county region. So that data is there. And just like when we were crafting the subcorridors, there's no one map, for instance, that tells you how to do it. You have to take all of it together. You kind of overlay things. Some data tells you some things, other sets of data tell you other things. I suppose that does speak to, sometimes we like to do indexes, so we could take a number of metrics and combine them together. So I guess I will take that in part as a methodology comment, Skip, and that's something that we'll consider if there is a way to take a number of different indicators and kind of mash them all up and find out what, and see what that tells us.
Dave asks in slide 14, which I've flipped to in anticipation of this question, in Imagine Austin, we decided to talk about housing affordability instead of affordable housing. The former is about housing, transportation, utilities, etc., as opposed to the latter, which is about rent and mortgage. Very good point, Dave. Is the reason we called out affordable housing specifically, does that have anything to do with other criteria, evaluation criteria?
Right, FTA criteria.
That's the Federal Transit Administration, the folks from whom we would like to get money for this project.
Right, and their capital investment program, of which New Starts and Small Starts are part of the funding mechanisms of that, they explicitly cite affordable housing under two different criteria, both economic development and land use. So those are part of the project, part of the project justification, overall project justification criteria. I guess just to give you a quick rundown, FTA criteria is split into two pieces. We have project justification and financial capacity, I believe. Those are each equally weighted at 50% of the overall project rating. And then of project justification, you have 6 different subcategories: mobility, cost effectiveness, congestion, land use, economic development, and one other one that's escaping me right now.
He's having an oops moment.
Yeah. Point being that that both economic development and land use speak specifically to affordable housing. The land use criterion looks at the amount of affordable housing within a project corridor relative to the amount of affordable housing within the county or counties that a project traverses. And the economic development criteria considers the plans and policies that are in place in a corridor that sustain or increase the supply of affordable housing. So that's a really important focus of the feds, so we've included it here. But that's not to say that we couldn't have other measures that speak more broadly to affordability and household affordability, which often relates to the ability of a project to reduce transportation costs, which eat up quite a bit of household affordability.
Great.
So thanks, Dave.
Mateo has number 3. The third suggestion for looks like a goal or an objective. Rail should serve to increase access and connections, and he has parenthesized here, rail will not solve congestion, but rather direct where a beneficial density will develop. So that's another constructive comment, I think, that Mateo has suggested for maybe a goal or an objective. We'll move on to Skip's next question. Socioeconomic criteria needs to include the trends, which are clearly that population and employment are both moving away from the core and becoming fully self-sufficient outside of the core. I don't know how to address that one. I'd say that I don't think there's much disagreement there. There's growth in both areas. There's growth in the core, and there's growth outside the core, certainly. Yes, several of our more suburban communities are emerging into activity centers. That's what we want. That's really the Campo vision. But we still have to connect them. Even though I was in Hutto this morning talking to the City Council and Chamber of Commerce, and I hadn't been out there in quite some time, and they've got almost everything out there. They've got higher education now. I don't think they have a hospital yet, but they've got lots of retail they didn't have 5 years ago. So they are emerging into an activity center. They don't quite have the jobs housing balance, but anyway, so we have these places that are developing, but I think most of them do work somewhere else. And so even though these places are developing as activity centers where you can be fully self-sufficient, the reality is you're going to need to leave that activity center frequently for other things. And so we do need to still provide connections to the activity center. So I think we're still on track with our Project Connect goal there. But good question or comment, Skip. Andre asked, can we get better definitions of many of the terms in defining the problem? It's so hard because you're trying to say so much in a problem statement that sometimes you got to use words that mean lots of different things. But that is something we can potentially work on, is trying to be a little bit more plain with our language or more precise maybe with our language, Andre. I think it's a good point and something that we'll take to heart. If any of you, I think Kyle may have mentioned or Scott may have mentioned, have suggestions for how we might want to word some of these problem statements, really what's important is what it's saying, right? The point. But if there's a way we can improve how we're saying it, and let me just flip to that while I'm talking about it, please feel free to wordsmith them for us. because that's often the most painful part of these projects is trying to wordsmith things. But if you have suggestions, we'd love to hear them.
But one of my suggestions and challenges to the project team is to simplify. So any suggestions you have along those lines, recognize they will be heard. We definitely want to make sure that we can do what we can to make this a more understandable process. There's a lot of complexity, as your comments have indicated, and we recognize that we need to do a better job of simplifying where we can.
I'll throw it out there. Whoever suggests the best set of problem statements, I will give them a 31-day regional pass, which, as you know, is getting more expensive. So that's quite a prize. That's our contest now. How about that? So somebody tweet that or post that on Facebook. I'm offering a 31-day regional pass for the best suggested set of problem statements that sound great. I appreciate that.
And I will note that we are in the process of developing a glossary of terminology. We do recognize that often our choice of words tends towards the technical. So if there were specific terms that we had used in the problem definition that you were concerned with or had questions about, follow up in the comments or send us an email. So we are certain to include that in our glossary.
All right. We've got several more questions. I don't think we're going to be able to make it to all of them, so just let you know we will answer all of these and we'll post them online. But let me just see if we can get to a couple more because these are really good. John says, okay, you guys just mentioned we'll receive a follow-up survey, perhaps best form to post type of question I just asked. Thanks, keep up the great work. Well, thank you for the comment, John, and we'll get that out here in the next couple of days. It'll just be a survey monkey, and it'll pretty much mirror what we the questionnaire that we asked folks to run through at the open houses so that we can combine all of that feedback. Tyler says he's surprised to see that UT campus isn't included in the core area since it's the most popular destination in the region. Shouldn't it be included regardless of which subcorridor is chosen? Well, I think as Scott mentioned, that is a suggestion we've heard from others and something to consider. So thank you for that. You're not alone in thinking that. Dave says, I believe you should show ABIA, that's our airport, on the subcorridor map, even though it is outside of the central corridor. Actually, that's when I've been at the open houses and showing those maps, we have had people say, where's the airport in here? Because even if nothing else, it's a good orientation for folks because folks seem to know where the airport is. So thanks for that feedback, Dave. Susan asks, will the questionnaire allow for detailed comments and input, or will it only be multiple choice? It will be both, Susan. That's how we had the questionnaire set up on paper at the open houses. And so we'll also allow comments, and we'll collect those as well. Susan goes on to ask or comment, the particular route selected determines how desirable the subcorridor is. Will we choose only one subcorridor, or will there be 2 to 4 subcorridors so that we can compare routes in different subcorridors? For example, a route within a subcorridor could be very expensive, making it not desirable. The second most preferred route might be in another subcorridor. That's a good point. That does add another layer of complexity to what we're doing. But Kyle, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, that's a comment that we've heard over the last month or so, and we are working through that. One of the challenges that we have is that there are lots of competing demands, lots of competing needs. We're trying to establish that first direction, but the suggestion of looking at an alignment perhaps that would extend into multiple subcorridors is very reasonable. It may be that it's more of a vision statement as opposed to a first project that we would look forward to. One other suggestion that has come up is rather than just identifying a single project or subcorridor, let's call it, maybe we look at prioritizing these so that we establish one as the initial investment subcorridor, but then we start to link these together, again, reinforcing that idea of building a system. So I appreciate the comment. That's an excellent one that the project team and others are wrestling with. I think that as you stay tuned through this, you're going to start to see us respond to some of those questions.
A comment from Jace. He says he appreciates that explanation regarding UT Capitol downtown. You're welcome, although I think it was somebody else who did that. Amir asks, any thoughts on the Reconnect Austin initiative? Do you think this is something viable for Austin? That's the burial of IH-35 or depressing of I-35 and capping it.
Yeah.
Cut and cap. You know, on paper, I love to think it's beautiful. I'd love to see it, but I can't.
We're all about connections.
Yeah. So I don't know how that might impact this project, or I'm not terribly familiar with the feasibility, but I know there's good people much smarter than me working on that right now.
Well, I would say that if that's the direction, and with any project that emerges in the My-35 or the Mobility 35 study that comes out of it, some of it's a matter of timing, and certainly as working on transit for the Central Corridor, it might be great to have some good high-capacity transit alternatives in place before we start tearing up I-35. But other than that, really no other comment.
I would offer, based on experience, that transformative projects like that are tremendous opportunities for the implementation of high-capacity transit with this. So, if that project were to emerge, I would go back to that priority of north and south corridors along I-35. But all of a sudden, we may alter our prioritization in order to take advantage of an opportunity that presents itself in that regard. So that's something that we're going to be watching very keenly as the project rolls out.
Paul asks, thank you. Paul asks, can you give an estimate for how many miles of urban rail we should expect in the first iteration? Well, I think one of the questions we have to answer is, are we doing urban rail, right? We're going to look at modes in phase 2 of this project, but what would you say on that?
Well, I don't think we have a budget in mind at this point. I will say that when the city had proposed a first phase of urban rail back in May of 2012, we were looking at about a $550 million project in capital, and half of which would come from a bond election. So, I think there's an interest in a project generally in that size, but I think now that we're taking a more comprehensive look at the Central Corridor, and working with the community, I mean, hey, if the community wants to do a bigger project, I think then it's incumbent upon us to see how we can help facilitate that. So I think at this point, we have no preconceived notions about that.
As we get into phase 2, we'll run into the bang for the buck exercise as well as we look at the different modes. We'll take a look at some of the needs. So the cheaper alternatives, cheaper modes would allow us to have a much longer service that we could implement. But that is a great question. You're right on target with where we're going to be heading early next year.
Okay. Maybe let's take one more, because I know we're running out of time. We're starting to lose people. So one more. Andrew asks, isn't the possibility of continuing info linking up with one of the other identified regional corridors an enormously important consideration in both identifying the subcorridors and certainly in evaluating them? Seems like, yes, that's important. That's going to that system challenge, right? That system problem statement. So certainly, we know there's already some high-capacity transit that's built, like Metro Rail, and some that's about to come online, like Metro Rapid and the Express Lane. So certainly we'll be looking at those if one of our problems ends up being how to deal with integration. And I guess, I think we'll have the good fortune of the North Corridor LPA being identified before, probably right around the time we're starting step 2 or phase 2 of this project. So, Andrew, it's a good point. I think we have that coming together as well. So that will certainly influence some of what we're doing.
Yeah, and I'll add, Andrew, that to me sounds like a criteria for selecting a priority subcorridor, and perhaps a criterion that we may not have explicitly identified. So that's the kind of feedback we're looking for. So when you do get your opportunity to do the online questionnaire, or if you make it to our public meeting next week, there's the opportunity to add criteria, suggested criteria, and then when we ask you to rank them, you can use the ones that you've added in that prioritization of criteria. So thank you.
Okay, so look, I know we've got lots more comments and questions from Paul and Andrew and Brett, Skip. Got some more, Mateo, Jace, Carla, June, Seneca, and I really apologize, but we've about run out of time. But we will get to all of these questions and try to answer them within the next several days, and then get them out, post them on the website. Again, we have recorded this webinar, so if you want to go back and listen to it again, you're crazy, but you have the ability to do that. So it'll be out there, and hopefully you can share it with your friends and get them to listen to it so we're all on the same page. I will mention that we have one more public meeting that's scheduled that will cover a lot of this same information. So if you want to put a face with a name, you can come visit with us next Wednesday evening at the Norris Conference Center right there next to North Cross Mall, or what used to be North Cross Mall, rather. I'm trying to pull up the website there on Anderson. There we go. So if you go to our great website, by the way, which is projectconnect.com or connectcentraltexas.com, and if you go to news and events, get involved, rather, you can look at upcoming public meetings, webinars. You can watch our previous webinar, which I do encourage you to watch, so you can get more information about the process. You can sign up for email updates. There's a link to our online forum, which we will be updating here very soon, so we can get more feedback from you. We really want your participation. In addition, in this, give us your feedback. If you belong to a neighborhood association or a community group, or you want to get a bunch of your neighbors together, we would love to come talk to you and get your input face-to-face on this project at whatever phase of the project that you'd like to be involved with. And you can, there's a form on there under Give Us Your Feedback where you can fill that information out so we can get back to you. But again, we really appreciate you participating in this webinar, and you hopefully will participate in future steps and phases of this project, because we really need your help to make some of these important decisions for Central Texas. Is there anything you want to leave with?